Okay, well, welcome to the final session. I have the pleasure of introducing Wayne Clough, who I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but I still want to say a few things about his great accomplishments during his long career. As you know, Wayne is the Secretary Emeritus of the Smithsonian Institute and President Emeritus of Georgia Tech. And he's also a native of Douglas, Georgia, one of our own. I wanted to elaborate a little bit further. His experience as the 10th president of Georgia Tech from 1994 to 2008, and really the first alumnus to serve in that position. Some of the highlights of his presidency at Georgia Tech include the transformation of the campus into the Olympic Village and 2 competition venues for the 1996 Centennial Olympic Games. During his tenure, the national rankings of Georgia Tech rose to the top 10 in the public schools, public universities, and the student population increased from 13,000 to 18,000. The funding of external research increased from $200 million to $425 million. And he had oversight for 2 successful national fundraising campaigns, resulting in increased endowed faculty positions, new cross-disciplinary research initiatives, and support for students, including the Wayne Clough Georgia Tech Promise Scholarship, allowing financially disadvantaged students to graduate without incurring any debt. As the 12th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute from 2008 to 2014, of course, he led the world's largest research and museum complex, including making it the first institute-wide commitment to sustainability. He also created the Smithsonian Education Office of Smithsonian Education, the Office for Cross-Disciplinary Research, and the Marine Global Earth Observatories Network. Also, he helped raise more than $1 billion in philanthropic gifts, creating new endowment positions for the museum, including that for center directors, scholarships, fellowships, and providing funding for new buildings and exhibits. Of some of his recognitions, of course, one is elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1990, and was elected to American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2010. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wayne.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much, John. I'm a little bit overdressed today, I suspect, but I was invited to go to the investiture of our new president tonight, so I had to wear and I had to prove I still have a suit. I don't wear a suit. But it was a beautiful day. Thanks, John, for the introduction. John and I served on a commission for the National Academy. It was about the future of environmental engineering, and for 3 years, and it was a pleasure to be with John and hear his insights into where we're all trying to go. And obviously, that whole endeavor had an awful lot to do with sustainability and what it all means in the future. So it was just a joy to work with John. This afternoon's session reminded me a little bit of an experience I had when I was a professor at Stanford. And so I got invited to give a talk at an ASCE convention, one of the big ones. And I finally got serious about, where I was going to be speaking in the program. And I looked in the program, and I was on the last program of the last day in Las Vegas. And I thought, wow, there's nobody going to show up. So I decided what I would do. I had a whole bunch of graduate students, and I talked 15 of them, I brought them into going with me. And I said, I'll pay you way. You get to enjoy yourself and don't get to do everything. But you have to show up for my talk because I don't know how many other people do that. So on the appointed time, at 3 o'clock from 3 to 5 session on Friday afternoon, last day of the session in Las Vegas, I looked out over the audience and there were 17 people there. 15 of them were my students. I'm glad to have you all here. But first I want to congratulate everyone who worked on the Sustainability Showcase. I mean, it's really amazing how this has come together. Michael, Thank you for your leadership. I know this is a labor of love for you, and it's absolutely remarkable for me. It's nice in a way that we're commemorating the presidency of Angel Cabrera, who is a big champion of sustainability. We've got the running start with Dr. Cabrera. You may know that he is one of the leaders of a new initiative. It's called the University Global Compact. That calls on universities to partner with the United Nations in achieving the 17 goals of sustainability for a living world. So Angel is going to be a tremendous champion for our efforts here for protecting sustainability. Now, for me, this showcase is particularly meaningful and exciting. When I came to Georgia Tech as president in 1994, I was already a believer in the power of sustainable design. And after a week or two to get my feet on the ground, I was both encouraged and discouraged. I was encouraged because I learned that Georgia Tech already had a Center for Sustainable Technology. And it had been founded in 1992, 2 years before I got there, by a $1 million gift from the GE Foundation. It was led by Carol Carmichael, who we all know well, and who married our friend John Chanel, who is also a champion of sustainability. And Charlie Leota. Charlie Leota has the distinction of being one of the few faculty at Georgia Tech who actually taught classes when I was a student here. And Bert Ross has been into the same sustainable design. And a friend of mine, Jorge Vanegas, who left Georgia Tech and went to Texas A&M, and I runs a big center on sustainability. Great people. Now, I said I was also discouraged when I came to Georgia Tech. I was discouraged because I think it's an understatement to say when I looked around at the Georgia Tech campus, which looked a lot like when I was a student there, it seemed to present no evidence that Georgia Tech cared about sustainability on this campus. Pretty discouraging. If I want to put that in perspective, my academic career was a little bit checkered, but it took me to some great institutions, including Duke University, Stanford University, Virginia Tech, and the University of Washington before I got back here. And what those universities have in common, and if you look up any list of the 50 most beautiful campuses in America, they're all near the top. So I have spent my academic career on campuses that were just gorgeous. Now I've become president of a campus where the dominant architectural feature outside of the historical district was asphalt surface paving lots. And that was the discouraging. Which brings me to one of the points I want to make in my remarks. At a university, I believe there are two sides to the sustainability coin. One side is the education and research activities that the university undertakes, and the other side is what the institution itself does to support the ethic of sustainability. And I think we have to do both. And we have had a big job before us when I came to Georgia Tech, but along the way we created a passionate team that really made a huge difference in tackling this problem. My remarks were really, I tried to figure out what I really should try to say today, and I really had a hard time with it. But I decided that I would just focus on a 10-year period during my tenure as president and what I think that did in terms of establishing a basis for proceeding with sustainability. And that was from 1994 when I came until 2004. I would leave in 2008, but from 2004 2008 was more or less finishing up the job. But the other part was, the initial part was very important. And I do suggest the foundation was laid towards establishing Georgia Tech on the road towards a sustainable future. Now, there's one person I'd like to cite early on who served as an example to me and encouraged me not to be timid about the commitment to sustainability. And that person was an alumnus, Ray Anderson. Ray was the CEO of Interface, a carpet tile business, which normally wouldn't associate with sustainability. But Ray got religion. And he got religion in a way that you could hardly imagine it. He committed his company to zero waste, zero carbon footprint, you name it, he did it all. And he became a leader. He became recognized as a moral leader in the business of sustainability. And I don't know how many of you had a chance, if you ever had a chance to hear Ray speak, but he would go into groups where, big room full of business people. John Brock would know this. And he would say to this group, he would start off by saying, I want you to know that all of us in this room 30 years from now, if we keep doing what we're doing, we'll be in jail. Because what we're doing now to our environment is criminal. You could kind of hear a pin drop in the room after that. Not many people started off a Rotary Club talk with that kind of message. But Ray set an example, and he would call me up whenever he thought I was falling off the wagon a little bit and tell me to get back on it and stick with the course. And of course, he endowed our first chair in sustainability and industrial engineering. And his foundation today provides much ongoing support for us for our efforts today, especially in the Global Change Program, which I've had some involvement with Kim Cobb. So I said there were total two pieces. So the education research piece I'll talk about first, but very briefly, because I really don't think I have to. I mean, the evidence is right here on the wall. If you look at what's coming, what you did today, and what's coming in this sustainability showcase, you can see we actually have become a leader in sustainability. And a lot of people can be said to have credit for that. But it's amazing. I will say it had a modest start, because if I had made an announcement when I came, and I said, I want to meet everybody on campus who's working on sustainability, I would not have reserved a very big room, because there were probably only about 10 people there. But the credit does go to Carol Carmichael, who was there, Charles Leota, Chuck Eckert, Bert Bross, and of course, not too late after that, Jean-Louis Chameau, who was vice president for research, vice provost for research, dean of engineering, and then the provost. And through those three jobs, he had an enormous influence, and he was an enormous champion for sustainability. From their efforts, of course, I mentioned the Center for Sustainable Technology. Well, it would expand on Earth Day in 1999 to become the Institute for Sustainable Technology and Development, a center now with an institute-wide mandate. And just before I retired, we were fortunate to get a gift from Brooke Byers, and the Brooke Byers Institute for Sustainable Systems was created under the leadership of John and Michael, and it's done wonderful things since I left. So that was, I think, a wonderful outcome. But today, if you look around at Georgia Tech, of course, there are centers for sustainability in every college. It's remarkable how it all spread, but it's only right that it does, because it's a multidisciplinary subject. You cannot do this as an engineer or a scientist or business or architect or planner without considering all the dimensions of it. So sustainability is important. I'll just make one other quick comment about the program. I was very glad to see a number of people talking about climate change, because I think climate change is an important companion with sustainability. And I say that because in addressing climate change, sustainability is necessary. Everything you do in sustainability almost is good for combating climate change. But it's not sufficient, because you can design a perfectly sustainable city, but if it's under 10 feet of sea level rise, water is not there anymore. So it's not sufficient. But these two things are partners. They have to travel together. We have to travel them together, so we optimize the effects of one on the other and try to create our world as a living planet. One of the things John mentioned, I was at the Smithsonian, that I learned there is we worked a lot on genomics, adding genomics to Smithsonian's portfolio of work. In natural history, they have about 500 PhD scientists. People don't realize that. They're the world's largest collection of specimens, 147 million specimens. And so we were working very closely with NIH, because NIH was working on the Human Genome Project. And I used to joke with my NIH friends, I said, you got it easy. You're just worried about one genome, one measly genome, human. The Smithsonian's worried about 2 million. And you know, you think about it though, is you all had something to eat today, you had something to drink. All those other genomes are in your body. And in fact, they're all part of us. And so sustainability has to do with the entire planet and everything that's on it. Now, on the other side of the sustainability coin, the campus, that would probably prove to be more of a challenge to us, actually, because we were so far behind than education and research. I want you to keep in mind that in my mind, a sustainable campus is not one just committed to using sustainable design principles, but it's also one that has pleasing aesthetics, contributes to creative thinking and collaboration, and encourages students, faculty, and staff to feel like the place is a community. Further, a sustainable campus is not an island unto itself. In fact, it understands it has an obligation to help its communities and the city within which it lives to become a sustainable place as well. So when I arrived on campus in 1994, Georgia Tech, the campus had spent the last 40 years or so, and you don't have to take this from me, it's in other places, It had grown haphazardly, absolutely no attention to architecture or aesthetics, and building facilities by responding to the squeakiest wheel. So there were about 6 million gross square feet of facilities, which significantly underserved the need on campus. There are no new science buildings had been built since I was a student at Georgia Tech, 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And it was estimated the deferred maintenance was around 200 million, and nobody had any way to answer that. Now, added to this list, as I began to reach out myself in my efforts to work with the Metro Chamber and Midtown Alliance and other civic organizations, I found that they really only saw Georgia Tech as being meaningful to the city because we were going to host the Olympics, host the Olympic Village. That was about it. A typical example of that was at Midtown Alliance. They had a map of what Midtown was, okay? And that map went to the downtown connector to the west, and it stopped. And I thought, isn't that funny? You know, Georgia Tech's a pretty good school. Why would you not want us on the map? But we weren't on it, and what that was a message. We hadn't done anything to get on their map, so we had a lot of work to do. Okay, I'm not going to spend any time on the Olympics in these comments because it was a kind of a skewed, unusual experience. And when we talk about needs and facilities, sustainability, none of that was in the picture. You just had to do it. I mean, Dr. Crescenti committed us to do it. Keep in mind, our campus is only 440 acres. And it meant the whole campus was involved. It wasn't one like UCLA where you've got a giant campus and you put it over here. It didn't happen that way. But there were some good things that happened. So if you look at the numbers from 1994 to 1996, we had to complete $230 million in construction on our campus. We had some other obligations off campus. Almost all of which would be for housing, 800,000 square feet of housing. And not to be overlooked was the fact that over half of that 230 million, Georgia Tech borrowed. The Olympics didn't give it to us. Olympic didn't give us hardly anything. But it was borrowed so we could really create first-class residence halls, which you see today. And so that was really a good thing and much needed. I would say there are also two other outcomes from the Olympics that tend to get overlooked when you talk about the experience. First, to our south was Tuchman Homes, built in 1936 as the first public housing project. And over the years, it had become a place of despair, to say the least. But because of the Olympics, and because people realized you really don't want to have all those foreign visitors coming to Atlanta and seeing that place, and because Andrew Cuomo was at HUD, and they created a new fund to start renovating these older homes, Atlanta and Renee Glover, a great person, got that first grant. And with that grant, they tore down Tuchman Homes. The only real consequence of that immediately was all the rats that were in Tuchman Homes showed up at the office of the president. Fortunately, hawks realized this as well. We started to get hawks that helped save us. But Centennial Place Homes was a great outcome, and Centennial Place School was a great school for kids. And secondly, because early on, well before the Olympics, they started putting in security fences. And so while we weren't subject to pure security at that time, the only way I could get to campus if I had to drive was I had to drive over the freeway, over the downtown connector, and come in on 5th Street. And normally, you would never do that because that whole area was really depressing. The Biltmore had broken out windows, homeless people were living in it, the prostitution was rampant, there were needles on the street, it was a pretty bad news place. But what caught my eye was for sale signs. And as those for sale signs just kept ringing the bell with me, and I went to our foundation at that time and I said, now is our chance to buy some cheap property. And if nothing else, we do nothing else, but just acquire the property, we can actually sell it to somebody who will do something good with it. And fortunately, they agreed, and they were put as a risk on their part as well. But it really planted a seed for what would become Technology Square. Okay, so 1997, first master plan that really was a serious master plan for Georgia Tech because we hired some serious people to do it. Fortunately, we had Bob Thompson in place, who had come from the University of Washington after 25 years of tremendous executive experience there, a beautiful campus. And he reported to me when I was there and I was a provost. And he was fantastic and he really got it. And subsequently, we hired our first professional master planner in Les Saunders, who turned out to be a terrific person. Funny, for starters. He used to say, Georgia Tech is a museum of architecture. It has one building of every kind. But we also hired Wallace Robertson Todd, a practice out of Philadelphia, one of the very best at working with urban universities in developing master plans for the future. They were terrific and are terrific. They're still in business. And the basis for their plan was a facility study that Bob had done in 95 and 96, and it compared Georgia Tech's facilities to that of its aspirational peers. So we sent these teams to about 10 universities and said, come back and tell us what you can. But they asked a seminal question that was important. They said, where do you plan to be 20 years from now? And that was really depressing. It was bad enough to see what the present was. But what they concluded, obviously, was Georgia Tech was woefully short in the facilities it needed, particularly if you looked at our aspirational ideas. And we would even be more so behind the curve if we didn't do anything different, because they said, and rough way to look at it, we had to build a major building every year. Well, Georgia, the state of Georgia, typically, on average, gave Georgia Tech a major building every 5 years. So there's a little dichotomy there. So we had to start thinking and scratching our heads about what we would do about it. Well, without worrying about that, Wallace Robertson Todd took the result of the facility study and developed a terrific master plan for us to find out places to put all these buildings that we needed, but to create open spaces and green spaces, and in addition, eliminate 11 surface parking lots and add parking decks that look like buildings, convert a number of our streets to walking areas, to renovate 1.4 million gross square feet of older space to kind of get at that deferred maintenance thing. And to build, they said, 3.4 million gross square feet of new space by 2008. Now, in addition, we had to get rid of a building, and that was the Textile High Tower building. Some of you may remember it. It was right in the middle of campus, and that would be in the place where we eventually wanted to build a new campus center. And that was tricky. I had to visit the High Tower family and spend a lot of time with them, but we were able to do that. Of course, there was a little matter of money, and that was our problem. But fortunately, we had a group of circumstances that came together that made it possible. One thing was going on. John would appreciate this because he was involved with one of our capital campaigns. We just started our first national campaign, and it was going at great speed, faster than we ever imagined it. And we were also told when we started the campaign, you can't raise money for buildings because everybody thinks the state should build them. That didn't prove to be true. People were interested if you have good ideas. We also took on moderate use of debt financing. Georgia Tech had zero debt, and so there was a lot of capacity for debt that could be paid back by indirect costs from research. And so also a lot of support from other folks. So all the pieces came together at the right time. So now let's take a look at post-1997 real quickly and see what happened. So the 6 years following 1997 to 2003 proved to be a pivotal time for Georgia Tech. First, we purchased the land along 5th Street, the downtown connector, and the first concept was developed for Technology Square. I presented it to the foundation, and one member stood up, very thoughtful member, used to be a football player at Georgia Tech, and he said, Wayne, I have one problem with your plan. And I thought, uh-oh. He said, you're not thinking big enough. And what he meant was you had to have more buildings over there, or you'd never, and Ellen knows it, you'd never really attract others. And so he was so right. Well, with the help of the Georgia Tech Foundation and a remarkable team of architects and constructors and project managers, Technology Square officially opened in 2003. In 3 years, it opened. The project proved to be a winning combination of academic and commercial space. It provided encouragement to startup companies to locate there, and it changed that part of Midtown to a better place, and it established bridges to Atlanta because the mayors were very interested in this and realized what an economic development tool it would be for the city. I will just mention to you, since this is a little less known, in 1902, the city of Atlanta was having a major problem, and Shirley Franklin was the mayor. And she had a huge problem. She had been presented with a plan called the Clean Water Plan, and it was very ambitious, probably would cost $4 billion. But the city had zero credibility for anything because of the Bill Campbell administration that had crashed and burned due to corruption. So Shirley came to me and said, I need help. And she said, would you please form a task group that can help give us advice? And at first I looked at her and she could tell I was thinking about saying no. And she said, your wife said you're going to do it? Okay, she did. So I did it. Well, I told Shirley, here's what I'll do. I'll get 15 of the best experts in the country, and I will get them to sign a piece of paper saying they will not seek work on this project. But your job is you're going to have to pay attention to what they say, because they're going to tell you things that you may not want to hear. She looked at me and she said, Wayne, that's a great plan, and don't worry about the politics. I got your back. And she always did. So we had the best infrastructure engineers in the country working pro bono. And Mayor Franklin took the plan, and my other job was to get the 3 people who were suing Atlanta, the Riverkeeper, the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, the Georgia BPA, and the federal EPA, all suing the city. And we would have them meet at the president's house on the QT, and everybody would get together and put their eyes together. And I would keep saying, is this going to work? Is this going to work? So when we had the press conference and Mayor Franklin announced the plan, which is even better than we proposed, they were all sitting on the front row saying they loved it. So it was a great thing. Now, the next step was to get the tax measure passed with the Chamber of Commerce, and we worked on that as well. Well, the point of all that is twofold. One, it really built the bridges to the city, I think, that we were missing. And I think today you see the Sustainable Cities Initiative and all these things, they really follow through with that. And in addition, we realized that we owed a debt to the city to control our own storm runoff, and Rogers is here. So that project actually still ongoing. How do we with cisterns and the eco commons, all those things came out of that. Okay, so now between 97 and 2003, we completed our campaign, and we finished the first 3 buildings of the biotechnology complex, which wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And by 2003, we had added 3.5 million square feet in facilities. So we exceeded the 2008 goal in 2003. So we needed an update to the plan. So this brings me to the last step, and that was the 2004 master plan, which I think you'll find even today has a lot of bearing on what Georgia Tech does. And the reason it was, I think, so good was we had made all these mistakes getting there, and we figured out a lot of things. So we brought Wallace, Robertson, Todd back in, designed a new set of assumptions, and I'm just going to give you a summary of a few of those. First of all, we put up on the masthead the statement, the tagline from the 2002 strategic plan that John Liu helped develop, and that was, we will define the technological university of the 21st century. Now, once you say that's your tagline, you can't have a crummy looking campus. You can't have neighborhoods that look terrible. You can't have a campus that doesn't interact with your neighbors. You know, it really throws all that stuff out the window because that automatically sets a very high bar for what you're going to do. It also said plan for 4 million more gross square feet in new facilities over the next 10 years. Plan for an integrated open space system that reduces stormwater discharge and includes cisterns and creation of eco commons, which is actually running now, a piece of it right out here. Become increasingly involved with Midtown and the city, build facilities using sustainable design processes, create distinctive architecture and open spaces, and improve campus livability. There's a lot more to that plan, but it's well written, and you can look it up, it's on the web. So just in summation, I won't review the progress, just say we had a lot of momentum, and we really met our expectations. In the meantime, a new planning team, Les Saunders retired, and Howard Wertheimer came on, and Howard did a great job and with his team and Ann Rogers and others who are here to carry out the next phase. What's important is I believe that the 2004 plan established the basis for a reimagined campus, one that not only served the long-term interests of Georgia Tech, but also linked the campus with its surrounding neighbors. It recognized the importance of incorporating multidisciplinarity in education and research, the need for sustainable design and implementation, the value of aesthetics in building and planning and landscape design, and in providing a creative and welcoming environment for teaching, learning, and knowledge. Following my retirement, a new campus leadership team came on board, Bud Peterson and Provost Raphael Boss, and they took charge. But to their great credit, they continued to champion the idea of sustainability and sustainable design. And they've been enormously successful in really achieving the potential of Technology Square, which was something we didn't actually foresee, and growing the research enterprise. So I'm very grateful for that. So in closing, I'd like to thank Howard and Ann and Sandy Bramlett for giving me a lot of the information that I've cited here. And I'm always be indebted to the team that worked with me from 1994 to 2004 to make the things that I just described happen and as possible. So thank you. Those are a few of my comments. Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to entertain some questions.
Sure. Let me come down there.
Hey, Dr. Clough, you know me. Thanks for your talk today. My question is about your advice to Dr. Cabrera, in all of your wisdom, about as he's going through his strategic planning process, what you would recommend to him, and maybe getting some sustainability themes out of that.
Yeah. Well, I've known Angel for a long time, and he is a terrific guy. I think it's really a nice change of pace. I mean, I was one person, Bud was another person. Those were changes of paces, which were very good for Georgia Tech. And I think Angel's change of pace is going to be very good as well. He obviously is very internationally oriented. I mean, just because of where he was born and so forth. I got to know him early on because he was president of Thunderbird, which is a tremendous management school. And we put him on GTAP, and he did a terrific job there while I was here. So we got to see him up close and personal. When he came to George Mason, I was at the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian doesn't offer degrees, but we wanted to be involved with degree offering institutions. And George Mason proved to be a great organization to do that with because he was creative, as was his predecessor, Ellen Merton. And so I'll give you just one example. And this is in the vein of sustainability. The Smithsonian runs the National Zoo. A lot of people don't realize that. And it has a very large endangered species program, one of the largest in the world. They travel all over the world, deal with endangered species. And so they have a big operation out in Western Virginia, 3,000 acres, where they have scientists and genomicists and so forth who work on these issues all over the world. And so George Mason had a very strong program in wildlife management, ecology, and ecological system management. So we decided to put those two things together, and Angel worked with us to do that. And so we actually built joint facilities out in Virginia where George Mason students can major in, say, natural resource management and spend 6 months or a year out at this facility and travel with Smithsonian scientists to help save these species. And when I say it has to do with sustainability, just saving an animal doesn't do it because they've got to have a habitat. And habitat maintenance and habitat restoration is very complex business, as well as the human piece of that. And so this program emphasizes all of those things. Students from Georgia Tech can actually go there. It's a great program. Yeah, so I think what your suggestion will come natural to him. And he probably doesn't need my advice. He's been around a long time. But if he asks for it, I'll give it. Great.
Thank you, Dr. Clough. Great talk. And it's fitting that we're in this building as kind of a laboratory where we can study, all these aspects of sustainability and energy and water and in an educational environment. So my question to you is, how did you get the faculty on board thinking more locally as a good steward of the state and as a neighbor while they were trying to get tenure and thinking about global problems and using kind of the more constrained testbed approach as a platform?
Yeah. Well, you can't get, the fact of the matter is, I like to tell people that when you think about universities, there's the money ball and there's the energy ball. And the energy ball is what people do. And all faculty, without doubt, work 70, 80 hours a week. There's no question about it. And the question is, how can you squeeze anything else in there, and convince somebody to do that? And the answers, there are a number of answers possibly. One is you're not going to ask a young faculty member who's just trying to establish a reputation to do it unless they really want to, and unless their school chair and the head of their promotion tenure committee says it's a good idea, because you don't want to get them caught up 5 years later and find out they're in trouble. So that's part of it. So senior faculty will find their ways to do, they hit a point in their career, they want to do something different, and you've got to catch those people, and they're usually your leaders. So that's part of the, divvying up the energy ball, and universities, you got to get them out of the straitjacket of saying, there's only one way to get tenure, there's only one way to measure tenure and tenure progress, and that's tough, but it can be done. So we worked hard at it and tried to emphasize that. And I always knew we were making progress when we held a reception for new faculty, and I always asked the question, why'd you come here instead of MIT or Caltech or whatever, Berkeley? And they said, because Georgia Tech is really doing interdisciplinary work. She said, I would say, I've been to schools, they say they're doing it, and I can see they're not, and you are. So I think we made some progress, obviously, so you have to keep working at it. But a plan, some money, incentives, all help. Summer money for people so they can break off part of their time and spend some time on these things. Yeah, hey, Helen.
Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful reminder of, I think, just the amount of progress that, especially just in terms of the tech campus, how far we've come and the relationships really with the neighbors. I'm tempted to ask you sort of, okay, so now if we again say, where do we want to be in 20 years? And it's not, you don't have to, quite focus on that question again. But if the first step 20 years ago was, well, let's look at our peer institutions. Right now, our campus is pretty good. I mean, where else should we be looking? Where you get to travel and see so many places that are really being ambitious. Where do you set the bar now as we do, all of us begin to look at where should this campus be going in the next 20 years?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think, so if I were thinking about challenges that Angel and his leadership team face, is that one is how big is Georgia Tech going to get? This campus has gotten a little bigger, but not much. There aren't many more places to put buildings. There aren't many more places to stack people. And so the other thing I think Georgia Tech needs to think about is it's still 65% engineering at the undergraduate level. I don't think that's healthy personally. I always thought it would be better at 50-50 because in this world, to tackle the big problems, global change, climate change, you need good science, you need business school, good planning, good designers, and so forth. And you've got to have a balance of all those things. So I think Georgia Tech needs to think through that issue. And, in the old days, the answer was, well, Georgia Tech is the only school that provides engineering in Georgia. That is not true anymore. That is quite different. And in fact, I always thought that the day would come when University of Georgia would have engineering, would be logical, and it would be a good thing. And we needed to beautify our campus in part because they have a beautiful campus. So I just think Georgia Tech needs to think through this part of the equation. It's no longer required to handle all the applications in the state for engineering. And given that freedom, what do you want to do about it? I think with Angel, he's certainly going to think globally. And Georgia Tech is obviously a big global player. I used to tell people to quit worrying about U.S. News and World Report ranking. It's really going to be the global rankings where we're going to compete. And he has the mind for that. He has the experience for that. He's been all over the world many times over. So I think that's part of the game he will have to figure out, and he will. It's what Georgia Tech going to do. So managing this small diamond that we have here in the middle of Atlanta, this small place, is a challenge because of the pressures on it. And then how do you, instead of trying to concentrate everything here, what might you do elsewhere? And of course, to Dr. Croissant's credit, he started the campus in Metz. And when I came, it was just a graduate program, and it was kind of muttering along. And especially with Jean-Lou's help and Yves Berthelot, we decided that we needed to do something different over there. We wanted to bring undergraduates there in abundance, so that would take some of the pressure off this campus. So we eventually offered year-round undergraduate engineering there, and we hired permanent faculty there. So in essence, you have a bit of a model there. And Shenzhen, I think, offers that same opportunity to Georgia Tech. I've been there several times. John was with me when we were there. And they are offering, to build a whole campus to us with themes like climate change, sustainability are one of the main pillars of that program. So I think he'll have to mix and match the parts in a different way than I had it, or that Buzz Peterson had.
I had a question. Activism and sustainability. So sustainability is one of those, as we as scientists, we want to treat it as a sort of an objective science that yet sustainability by itself sort of encourages this level of activism, and the thought is that when that activism then transcends into our research, our education mission, that somehow we have an agenda, and our research is somehow biased towards that agenda in some way. And I think sustainability it's probably not the only discipline, but it's certainly one of the disciplines that is certainly subject to that bias in some way. How do we as academics sort of manage that sort of balance between, I mean, we have students that come in that have very strong values and want to encourage change, and then we ask them to become objective researchers and to sort of put their own biases aside and think about the data objectively. What's the data telling you? What are these and then we have other side outside that thinks of the universities as being, we're reprogramming their children, and we're going this direction. And how do we manage that in the 21st century? Is there a way?
That's a very good question. It's been around a long time in different frameworks. Chuck Vest was a good friend of mine, president of MIT, and he was always very thoughtful. And he said, research, for example, with corporations is inherently a conflict of interest for universities. But good universities figure out how to manage the conflicts of interest and do it well. And I always thought that was a wise way to put it, that one way to say is we're never going to do it, and then you become isolated from the community. The other way is you can be co-opted by it. But if you manage it and you manage that conflict, then you've got something. I think it's, the question about activism is a very interesting question, because I've written a little document about some of this, and the scientists in climate change were the ones who identified the problem, and some became more activists, and I think in a way kind of harmed the dialogue because they got out in front of the data in a few cases. But in addition, the scientists, unfortunately, the engineers weren't there to help them. The scientists took the brunt of this stuff. I mean, it was brutal what some of the companies did to some of the early people who were making the right call. But unfortunately, that dialogue over time became poison. And I think engineers have an ability, they have a different voice than scientists. And I think you can come in and be a little more easygoing with folks who got sensitivity, shall we say, and explain what's going on. I do think there's been a shift in, if you were to look at time for me anyway. When I was president of Georgia Tech, it was very difficult to have a conversation about climate change with, let's just say, a few tech alums. But there's such a change now in terms of what's going on. They do surveys, and I'm not picking on Republicans here, but they do surveys of people who voted Republican about climate change. And what you see now is a very clear pattern. If you live on the coast or you live in an area that's had severe forest fires, they believe in climate change. People who are in Minnesota and life is good, no threatened up there, they may not be in the same boat. So you got to understand your audience and where they're going. I mean, look, in South Georgia, I couldn't talk to some of my relatives about it now, but a couple of things changed. 3 things changed. One, Savannah at least, and the coast sees it all the time. They're getting blue sky flooding. I mean, they know what's happening. Tybee Island's about to disappear, those kind of things. And then secondly, in South Georgia, you go down and visit places where my parents grew up, where they had no electricity. There are solar panels all over the place. The people are making money off of solar power, and they like it. They don't want to be dependent on some big plant that spews out all kinds of stuff. So that, and then finally, Hurricane Michael really nailed South Georgia because it came up, and you may remember it's one of those hurricanes that was a 1, and about 2 days later it's a 5. And it is, other than Andrew, the only hurricane that actually hit landfall as a 5. You know, Katrina was a 3 when it actually hit. And it barreled up and tore up North Florida, but it went right across South Georgia. And unfortunately, South Georgia is a place that needs economic help to some extent. And they had tried to change. They'd started a really rich development of olive oil, because olives can be grown down there, and blueberries, and they developed all these alternative products, and pecans we call them. They're soft shell in South Georgia, and the Chinese love them. And so they were selling gobs of them, and they were planting more and more. And so 2 things happened there. One, Michael just destroyed that whole thing, and many of them have not recovered. And secondly, of course, our president, Mr. Tariff Man, put a tariff on, and so the Chinese aren't buying pecans. So, but I think people, just forget that part since it's not really climate change, but people even in conservative areas are seeing things they've never seen before. So, and sustainability falls a little bit into that same vein, but I think for students, you want them to be excited. You want them to be charged up. And you don't want to burn some house down because it's not sustainable, but you want them to be excited. You want them to push the boundaries where they can. So I think, but you got to work at it and know where the soft points are. Marilyn?
So, thanks, Wayne, for your comments. We started a project called Georgia Drawdown to see what kinds of solutions we might have here in the state to have a significant impact on CO2 emission reductions. And we're challenged by trying to find solutions that will engage rural Georgia. It's so easy to find the city solutions, but so more difficult to look to see what can the agricultural communities and the small towns across in both north and south. And anyway, I wonder, as I chart what looks to be our short list of solutions, they are tending not to be very inclusive. They'll take full advantage of the Office of Sustainabilities in Atlanta and the major cities, and we'll get industry and corporate Georgia engaged, but the small farmers, the rural households, small business in small town Georgia, don't know how to scale up the sustainability movement. It's harder to get to those populations. It's difficult to deliver rooftop solar one by one onto farm houses or chicken coops. Do you have any, can you help us out? Are we missing something? Have you found a way to engage these?
Well, there's no magic bullet. And I will say this, just to sort of, I'm from there, and I wrote a book about the place, which I think is about how the place became what it is through the vision of 13,000 years of collections at the Smithsonian. And it's all about sustainability and what is left out of what used to be there. It used to be a magnificent pine forest, and my relatives were timber people, and they cut that forest down, and it's only 2% of it left. So that's an example of humans are forever non-sustainable. I mean, the first animals that the humans saw when they came to Georgia were the giant sloths and the Columbian mammoths. They were all here in Georgia. They killed them, all. They're gone. So, the history of humans being good stewards is not very good. The record's not very good. One thing I would also say, when we were working on our original executive committee that you were on the Global Change Program, we did bring in some of the folks from Georgia Tech's Technology Transfer Group, and they're over, they work out with the small community. And one of the things they said, the difficulty is that when these companies in these small communities work on such a small profit margin, if you tell them they should go green, and they look and say, where am I going to get that money? And when is it going to pay back? And if it doesn't pay back, it doesn't make any sense for them. On the other hand, the corporate side is that companies like Walmart and the big Home Depot have suppliers in South Georgia and Costco. And they require their suppliers to meet certain standards. And so when people see they have to do it to be in the game, they will do it. They may not like it, but they have to do it. I think the other side of it is that you can't get to them just by this idea of being well-meaning and it's a good thing for you. The other thing that I think has been interesting to me is looking at the solar work that's done in South Georgia. Quite a bit was done early on, and it's still a little bit being done because the agriculture department had a program to subsidize solar installations for farms that needed the big chicken farms, the peanut curing folks. They use a lot of energy. And the idea there was not to build these big arrays, but to build an array for the farm. And that really went gangbusters. I've got a feeling this administration doesn't think very highly of that, but it was a big program, and I've talked to some of the farmers who got one in when the going was good. They love it. Their power bill went down, and it means that Georgia products are more competitive in the market. So it's a slow thing. Now, as I say, the other side of this coin is, and I'm from Douglas, Georgia, and Coffee County, and Douglas, Georgia has grown as opposed to an awful lot of towns in South Georgia. And one of the reasons it's grown is it's invested in itself. It merged the county and the city. They did it way back when it was a good time to do it. They jointly try to do things that help the community. I have to give my dad credit. He was a mayor in 1950. They didn't have a hospital, and he worked to get the bonds passed to build the first hospital. And he hated politics, incidentally, so he quit after that. But he got it done. Then now they have the regional medical system in that whole area, but they built off of that. They have great high schools. We have 15 kids from Coffee County High School here at Georgia Tech now, thanks to a lot of Georgia Tech alums giving money to help them, but they want to come here. So, and they've got 2 museums. They've taken down the railroad lines that were there and put in pathways for people to walk and so on. So communities that choose to invest in themselves are the ones that do the best with these other ideas. I get discouraged when I see communities that don't that just want. They say, help me, help me, help me. You know, and they've got to save their environment too. Ecotourism is a good possibility down there, and they've got to save it. Yeah.
Gil, we'll have the last question.
Oh, okay. Well, my question was more larger scale because you're talking about remote communities and things like that. And I know Georgia Tech's done some great job, and thank you for telling us the history because I was a student during most of that time. And so I got to see the campus transform. I used to walk down that tunnel that was like, you just prayed before you went in the tunnel under the interstate. And now it's so beautiful, and it's a center, and I'm very proud as an alum to talk about that with people. But I had a question about the university system of Georgia and Georgia Tech's role in trying to do this for all the campuses across the state. And what plans are those, or is that already being done in terms of sustainability and things like that across the whole university system?
The state is encouraging it, but they have, and in fact that probably makes sense, they discourage LEEDs designation because that's expensive, and to maintain LEEDs you got to keep it up. So the state's kind of got this little bifurcated view on that, but that's where, at least they're still encouraging it. Obviously they want to save money wherever they can, and saving power is a big deal. You know, I've certainly, you know, I've talked to a lot of folks about the possibility also of us having, and we've talked about having our own solar field. Why can't Georgia Tech build a solar field and transport the power up here to campus? It doesn't have to just put a few little tiny solar cells on top of the building. Or why can't the University System of Georgia do it for, say, 5 campuses down in rural Georgia and do it? I mean, they really aren't thinking outside the box, frankly, is what I think. Well, and it does, and of course Maryland's got the climate project, and we've got, that's joint with the University of Georgia and Emory. There's a lot of good collaboration coming up out of the sustainability efforts and the climate efforts, which is good. And now, let me just finish by telling you one tunnel story. So I always love it. So when I was president, you know, I had to read the crime report. Today that's mostly published, but so that I'd read these stories, you know, and they were usually sad stories. Somebody stole a bicycle or something. Anyway, this Georgia Tech kid was walking through the tunnel, and so the crime report says, the kid reports the crime. And he said, a young man approached me and pulled a gun. And he said, I want your money. And the Georgia Tech kid said, okay. So he opened up his wallet, and he had $3 in there. And the kid with the gun said, I'm not stealing from anybody who's poorer than I am. So there's a Robin Hood out there. Thanks, everybody, for having me. And thanks for what you're doing.